Justin, good good morning. For me, it's 5 p.m. But welcome to the Emil Barna podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on board to discuss all things sleep, dreaming, trauma, trauma therapy, and your story in terms of weaving all of these threads in. But I'm really honored to have you on board. I came across your work some weeks ago, in fact, and you've done a lot of recent work with people in
Ukraine,
the Russia Ukraine, yeah.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that Iran is coming to my mind because I had another guest on who was from Iran, and then I was starting to think the importance of this particular technique for those who are going through what's happening in Iran as well. And I'm like, oh, yeah, there's a lot of overlay there. So yes, Ukraine you did a BBC interview over there, and I just want to take a moment to allow you to introduce yourself to our guests very briefly, and then we'll just jump on into it.
No, thanks, Emil. So yes, I'm a trauma therapist in the UK. I trained actually only 14, 15 years ago. So I had a few different careers before that in business, consulting, engineering, and the military. So I came to therapy quite late, but very, very early on in that journey, I did come across EMDR, the eye movement therapy, which involves bilateral stimulation. Because I really recognized it was doing something different. And that's where I've kind of tended to specialize in trauma, EMDR, military people. And then really the interest in sleep disturbance and nightmares came through that, because nightmares are a pretty core symptom of PTSD. And I was looking for a subject for my for a PhD, for doctoral research, and came across some innovations in the field of treating nightmares, and that's really what I focused on. And finished the PhD in 2019. What was going to be a 3-year project turned into a 5-year project, as they often do. But it really did, it allowed me to really focus in one area and look for the most effective treatment methods and hope and make a contribution. That's really where the dream completion technique comes from. But it's always important to say, in the field of therapy, there's never anything brand new and unique. We're always building on the shoulders of giants, as I like to say. So I would like to think that what I've done is an enhancement of existing techniques. People may have heard of nightmare rescripting or image rehearsal therapy or loads of other different things that have gone on in the field of nightmares that have been reasonably well researched. But I kind of wanted to try and take that to the next level in terms of what I was doing. And one of the outworkings of that was a 5-minute animated video, which is on YouTube and been downloaded kind of 150k times, which my children say is nothing in the field of downloads. But for me, it's good, and we've also translated it into lots of languages. And that's where the Ukrainian project came from. Really, I got in touch with a Ukrainian therapist and a charity, the Prudence Trust in London. And we just created a Ukrainian language version, which then kind of led into me doing some pro bono webinars. So we trained 1,000 Ukrainian therapists, because, as you could imagine, disturbed sleep and nightmares in a war zone and in the periphery of a war zone, and for people affected by a war zone, are all very common. And the ironic thing is, even if, for example, if you've been subjected to trauma, or maybe your block of flats or house has been bombed, you're potentially going to experience nightmares. But also, many people will have nightmares about the worst thing that they fear could happen, which is the same thing. So even though it hasn't happened, they're still having the nightmares. So you're kind of getting a trauma load with there being no existential trauma, if you like. So it is a real issue. And we've had really good feedback from the Ukrainian therapists that I've been working with. And that really is part of the message of what I wanted to do, which is sharing tools and techniques that don't even require a trained therapist to deliver, but can actually relieve some of the trauma and the suffering associated with that. And that's kind of where that came from.
That's huge. I heard you say before that one of your missions is to, it's a huge thing, but to eradicate nightmares by 2030, is what you've said previously.
That might have been on one of my YouTube things, and yeah, I mean, when you get, I mean, this is one of the points I made in the Ukraine thing. You know, people are suffering enough during the day, and from the bombs and from the, you know, from all of the associated war activities and drone attacks, and it's horrendous. So, you know, there's no reason why they should also be suffering in their sleep. And the dream completion technique just offers a way of basically bending people's dreams so that they don't get woken up by them and they kind of recede into the background. And, you know, that's kind of, you know, so there is, you know, there's no reason why anybody in the world should be suffering from nightmares. And if you kind of start doing some basic maths, you know, 5% of the world's population, you know, there's billions of people are having nightmares and sleep disturbance, and that is, it is a possible thing to eradicate. You know, in many ways, you could say it's easier to eradicate that than, you know, tetanus, typhoid, polio, you know, those big things, diseases that we've done a great job in the world of eradicating. But somehow it's not seen as very sexy, or it's not seen as kind of important. And it's kind of there's something in the narrative of nightmares. Even back in the 30s, came across a quote, you know, from a doctor saying, you know, how inconsequential nightmares are viewed. But the reality is there's a lot of links towards suicide, even veteran suicide, which was a big issue in America and in the UK. I don't know about Australia. But you know, traumatic nightmares where the same thing keeps happening over, it just keeps the PTSD right here. It is the PTSD. So the fact that we've got a tool that could have a big impact and be spread in a very viral way is the exciting bit. The tricky part is making it happen. And even in the Ukraine thing, you know, my animated video has probably only been watched 5, 6, 7,000 times. That's a drop in the ocean for the hundreds of thousands, millions of people, probably, yeah, millions of people who are experiencing nightmares. That's why that's why I wanted to do the podcast, because you're just trying to get the message out there. And it's not complicated either. But trying to get traction is, you know, is a tricky old thing.
This is really important. I mean, I've been treating people with trauma for years now, and something like the dream completion technique, which we'll get into very soon about what it actually is, I've seen dramatic differences just by applying what you can find in your video online, what you can find in some of the handouts that you put together. People have been having, just the other day, I had a client of mine who emailed me, and she said that for the first time since about 10 years, she went to bed and woke up the next morning without any nightmare. It was just, she just had a bad dream, just a normal dream about work, which was a normal bad dream compared to the way she was
terrifying nightmares
before. And this is going into a person, this is going into the anniversary of her trauma, and she's never experienced that before. So just something as simple as doing this particular technique has been amazing. So before we bang on a little bit more about that, can you describe to us what the dream completion technique is, and or if there's anything we need to know before we get into the dream completion technique?
Well, I think there's two. No, definitely. So there's two key elements really to it. The first one is a kind of an education element about why we dream, why we have nightmares, and what's going on, because that can be really confusing for people. And that, first of all, that kind of, you know, psychoeducation is really helpful. So in essence, I mean, we're all dreaming 2 hours every night in 2 or 3 blocks. And whilst we're dreaming, there's this thing called REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, going on, which is kind of what powers the dreaming process. And for the most part, we don't remember. We're designed not to remember our dreams in a way. Long-term memory gets kind of turned off, and it's almost like every night, all of our emotionally laden material gets thrown in the washing machine, and then we do our dreaming, and we get to the end of it. We wake up and we feel refreshed physically from the sleep. but also emotionally from what that dream process has done. And yeah, most people don't know, but some people remember dreams, then you kind of forget them by the time you got to the shower, kind of thing. There's a very good book by Matthew Walker called Why We Sleep, which talks about dreaming being a psychotic episode. If you could plug a wire into your brain and see what's going on, we've got 2 hours of a psychotic episode, which is kind of quite remarkable. It's one of the most remarkable bodily processes that goes on, really. And it's all geared to emotional healing. Now, it's not surprising. We'll get into this later on, maybe. EMDR, the therapy, is using that same process. I don't want to say hijacking it, but it's using the same mechanism as a way of reconsolidating traumatic memories. But in terms of the dream process, the problem comes when the material that the brain is trying to resolve, and it resolves it in all kinds of weird and wacky ways, and we don't want to pay too much attention to how it does that, is that it's almost like the fuse gets blown. REM sleep is also quite close to waking. So if the material's really distressing, which it will be after a trauma, because that's what the brain's trying to process, that's when we get thrown out of the dream. And that's what a nightmare is. We wake up, we may be visibly, our heart rate might be pounding, we might be sweating profusely, we might be in a state of panic. The dream material may or may not reflect what's gone on in reality. Sometimes it's even worse than the trauma that's happened in reality. And sometimes people will be having this nightmare about an existential anxiety. As I said, people in Ukraine having terrible nightmares about being killed or being bombed, or their members of their family being killed when it hasn't happened, simply because the brain's trying to process that material. So the first thing is that, that's what a nightmare is. And the second thing is a change in perspective, because it feels very real. A nightmare feels real, and therefore it feels, if you're powerless in the nightmare, it feels like you're powerless to do anything. But we really want to change people's perspective on what's going on, so that they realize it's their dream that's going on inside of them. And it is like a film, it's like a movie playing, and they are the actual editor. They can cut and paste and chop and do whatever they want with it. And that's really the essence. Is we want dreams to complete so they don't wake us up. And we want that to happen in the background so we don't get woken up. And the way we do that is we bend the dreams in a new direction by creating new content to go into the dream before we go to sleep. And the simple rule is ideas get into dreams on the back of emotion. You watch a horror film, you're not surprised if you have a nightmare about it, a dream about it. And that's because ideas get into dreams on the back of emotion, whether it's very negative and fearful or whether it's very positive and feels good. And very often we're not interested in the narrative of the nightmare or resolving it. We might be interested in the theme. So if the theme is one of powerlessness, I wouldn't necessarily ask people what's going on in the nightmare. People get very preoccupied about what's in the nightmare, how awful it is and how terrifying it is. And we're not interested in that. We're just interested in where it needs to go. So I might say to someone, what does it look for Julia to look really powerful? Or who needs to be with Julia for her to feel really powerful? And then you can build a picture and a feeling and a body sensation and say, go to sleep thinking this is what I want to happen in my dream. And that can work very well. And there are thousands and millions of permutations of what that idea could be. From someone having nightmares about being sexually assaulted, they might decide to chop the person's head off with a sword. And it's really important to normalize that and say it's just a dream. It's just whatever you want to do to resolve the dream. What would feel powerful? You're not doing this in reality. You're not explaining it to others. You're not standing up in a court of law. You're not going to be, there's no morality. There's no laws of physics. You can do whatever you want. Or you may just kind of forget everything and just go off somewhere completely different. The Ukraine an example that someone had, their nightmare was bombs, missiles falling from the sky. So they just imagine, Putin's ball patch with the target on the top and the missiles falling on him. And, how does that feel? Good. They laughed at, you suggest the idea and they laugh at it. You go, yeah, no, that's what you want to happen. Let it go. Now, the strange thing is most people wouldn't necessarily remember the dream in the morning. What they remember is, blimey, I didn't wake up. And so what we found is that even someone that's had nightmares for 10 years, like you suggested, like you said with your client, it can change very quickly within 1 or 2 nights. Sometimes it might take a few weeks for others, but the resetting of our sleep pattern and the resolution of the nightmare can happen really quickly, which is, again, I use this very early in therapy, session 1 or 2, and it's just so tremendously stabilizing for people to sleep again. I mean, we all know if we miss a night's sleep, or if you've got young children, it's a bit of a grind. It affects our mental health, our physical health. So that's why I'm so passionate about it, because it's not complicated. It's not necessarily easy. And if someone has had a really, if a bomb has landed on someone's house and it has killed members of their family, you're not going to get glib about it. But one of the most useful ways for people who've been bereaved that I've found is to ask them the question, how would you like to remember this person? So you certainly wouldn't suggest manipulating the dream to change it as if it didn't happen or you were denying reality. But the idea that, how would you like to remember this person is a very, very congruent, very empathic way of resolving it. And it does work very well. I've done that with a lot of military people, maybe who've lost friends in Afghanistan, for example, who were maybe blown up, and they're having a dream about walking down the same path. And so there's no way you'd suggest to them, well, just pretend it didn't happen, or pretend you're all there doing this, or pretend, but the idea of how would you like to remember your friend, they'll normally connect in with some past positive memory, which is.
So they would essentially, so the person who's passed, they could integrate a positive one where they're walking down the path together as if the person's still alive, or is that
what is it?
Not.
No,
what is
definitely
that?
not. What we're doing is we're integrating it with some previous past memory that's generally positive. So, for example, when I did this with a military veteran, he remembered, having a barbecue with his friends, and they were all there. And in the UK, we have a kind of there's a real strong military connection, particularly when it's concerned with kind of parties, fun, and alcohol, and that's kind of, you're connecting with that memory. And so you're going to sleep thinking, this is what I want to dream about. And whether you don't, this is the interesting bit. For the most part, people don't remember it, but it just gets integrated into their dream on the back of the emotion. Sometimes people do remember it, but the aim is to keep people asleep. The aim isn't to remember dreams. The aim isn't to do lucid dreaming. We might get onto that. This is not lucid dreaming. This is just helping keep the washing machine of the dreaming mind asleep and allowing the dream to complete. And again, those trained in Gestalt therapy, you'll know, Gestalt means kind of the completion of the whole, if you like. And it's a bit like that. And it just works well. And it does tend to work better when you're co-creating, when you're working with a therapist, or even a coach or support worker could do it. It does help the person really, because you've got to think outside of the box sometimes. And when you're in it, it's quite hard. So, and I've got some research ongoing in the UK in a mental health service where we've integrated dream completion as part of standard treatment for anyone with nightmares. It's not just PTSD, all sorts of conditions, because most people don't talk about it. Even with therapists, therapists wouldn't necessarily ask about people's sleep or nightmares. It's much more common than you think.
Yeah, dreams aren't really talked about on a day-to-day within the therapeutic realm, unless you might make comments that a person with trauma is waking up at night, but often there's not a deep discussion around dreams for whatever reason, and yet they're some of the most distressing things.
Yeah, the only other exception, though, is the more kind of Jungian psychoanalytical, Freud's dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, which, they can be helpful. Dream content can, of course, be helpful. But Freud didn't write much about nightmares. And so, for me, it's about symptom resolution. Nightmares are waking people up 5 times a night. That's the issue we want to solve. And it can, but because of that kind of, people tend to have a preoccupation with dreams and dream content. So a really common thing is for there to be fictional material in the dreams that can be very distressing. So, for example, a policeman who's had to deal with lots of traffic accidents might have an amalgam dream of various things coming in, snippets of different traumas in that dream. Then he might come across a car with his family in it, and his family are dead in the dream. And that can be really distressing. And then, of course, leave him open to think, why on earth did I dream that? And you get really preoccupied and fixated on a trauma that hasn't happened, that's worse than the stuff he's already dealt with. So in these situations, I just help people just to say, that's just the brain bringing stuff in, and it's just a failed attempt with a dream. It doesn't mean anything. And we just want to kind of leave that to one side and kind of which direction do we want it to go in? Steer away from that.
For someone who's listening in and they're struggling with dreams, with nightmares, the things that have happened before, or even just anxious nightmares about things that losing control of a vehicle or something. What are some of the most practical things that they could do tonight to be able to change that script and to be able to wake up a little bit better in the morning?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing I say is have a look at the 5-minute YouTube video, because that just pulls everything together. And there are some tips and tricks in using this. But essentially, at the point where you're thrown out of the dream, that's the point where we want to kind of springboard into a new direction. And it's kind of, what do I want to happen next that feels good? But it doesn't have to follow the narrative. So if, for example, you are having, if for example, you are having a nightmare about drowning, you might, and where you might want to take it is riding a roller coaster and whatever. You can do lots of different things. In fact, it's because it's not logical. Dreams are not logical. That's kind of the first method. That's the first most important lesson with all of this. Is not logical. It's just stuff. And we can put whatever stuff we want in there. I've kind of experimented sometimes with people just going to sleep thinking about their favorite TV person, or going something very, what does freedom look like? And bring up a picture of freedom in your mind. What does powerful look like? What does being fully alive look like? And those things can work just as well. We're not looking, and this is one of the issues with the older techniques, which are called nightmare rescripting, where there'd be no psychoeducation. And you'd just be told to end the dream any way you want, and off you go. And you'd also have to write down your nightmare several times, so you're kind of getting exposure to it. And that can be too much. People will drop out from being asked to do that. So, experimenting with what are the safest, the safest thing is not to have any contact, particularly with the bad stuff, the past nightmare, and just decide a new direction that seems to maybe responds to the theme of the nightmare. So powerlessness, powerful, danger, what feels very safe. And you're just manipulating stuff to give yourself the best possible chance of not being woken up by it. It sounds simple, but it's not necessarily easy. I remember one of my early PhD trials with some veterans in Scotland, and these people, drinking a bottle of whiskey a night to go to sleep, driving around in a car all night to avoiding going to sleep, because they knew that as soon as they got to sleep, the juggernaut was coming towards them and they couldn't do anything about it. It's at the more severe end of things, these are really severe things associated, as I said, with suicide and all sorts of stuff, because it's just, you can't stop it, or the perception is you can't stop it.
There's a few ways. Yeah, sorry, to interrupt, because addiction is another thing that we could really go into in terms of a limiter for people to be able to even access their dreams, or say people who use cannabis a lot don't remember their dreams necessarily speaking. There are always exceptions. Or I've heard that cannabis actually increases a person's tendency towards sleep paralysis. and that can actually exacerbate sleep paralysis. So that
Yeah.
I have a client, for example, who, when she wakes up, she can't move. She's in between that sleep
Awake and
and
asleep. Yeah.
yeah. And what she used to experience was demonic faces and all these things that just terrified her. And then more recently, with the dream completion technique, she was still waking up with sleep paralysis,
Yeah.
but instead of those frightening experiences, she was waking up with snuggling up with a wolf that she had
Right.
come up with in
Yeah.
that she wanted to dream on. So the sleep paralysis wasn't as deadly in a
Severe.
way,
Yeah.
as severe as it was prior to. But so addiction, sleep paralysis, these sorts of things. How do you work around these when it comes to the sleep
Yeah.
completion technique?
Well, I think there's a couple of different things. The first thing, sleep paralysis, is a really, really interesting one, because the common kind of, the thing from the myth is almost what you described, waking up, appearing to wake up with the devil on your chest and you're paralyzed and it's terrifying. And it is between, you are in that period between being asleep and being awake, hypnagogic period, I think it's called. But the reason the sleep, it's a bit like a nightmare. The process has gone wrong. Sleep paralysis is a natural part of REM sleep. So we undergo mild paralysis of the body during REM sleep whilst we're dreaming, as a way to stop us acting stuff out, to stop us thrashing around, to stop us moving, whilst we let this dream process go on. And again, if we get thrown out of the dream, sometimes we kind of continue experiencing sleep paralysis. And the general response is always one of fear and panic, and that we want to wake up. We want to get out of it. And if you're with a bed partner, they will try and get you out of it. But actually, in a way that you've experienced with your client, we don't want to wake up. We want to stay asleep. So having the wolf thing is great. We want to encourage everything to go back into the washing machine rather than the door open and everything spilling out. And again, it's really, I had a client recently who was having kind of delusions and hallucinations on waking. They thought they were awake, but of course they're not awake. But until they really understood what's going on, this is like, quite a scary appearing to be a scary psychotic episode. So it's all about encouraging them to stay asleep and creating really powerful dream ideas. The wolf one is a great one. People can make use of and use spiritual resources as well, and sometimes you do get into that elemental, good, evil, light, dark. And one of and of course we never impose our own spiritual beliefs on people. But one of the things I always say is that, if you've got light and dark, they're not yin and yang. Light will always overcome dark. Dark can't overcome light. If you turn a light on and it shines through the dark, can't do the reverse. So you encourage them to stay asleep with the sleep paralysis end of things. The addiction side of things, I have been in touch over the years with people who work in addiction services. And one of the most interesting elements of that is people in rehab and people in rehab basically having using dreams, which turn into, which may wake them up, which then keep the whole, it makes the whole rehab process more of a white knuckle ride. They're trying to get rid of this and this stuff is chasing them. And again, using some good, new dream ideas to help that process worked really well. So you'd never encourage someone to kind of amplify their using dreams. You'd kind of use questions like, what does your life look like when you're completely free of substance abuse? What does it look like? And then you're creating something with that. And again, that's, we just want to bend the dreams into a new thing so they're not being disturbed by using dreams, because it's just pulling, it's like literally pulling them back into it. They wake up in the morning and it's there, reusing is here. We don't want that. So it takes many forms, and yeah, it's a very flexible technique. But as I said, exploring all of these different areas of use does require a bit more than the 5-minute video, which is why I do a 3-hour webinar for therapists to really give them a deep dive into the technique. And
Which
I've
we'll
got,
definitely be linking into and
yeah,
in the description here, as well as giving people access to your page. I do want to
yeah,
speak a little bit about the using dreams, because this is something that I've experienced even more recently with one of my clients. So she'd quit cannabis
yeah,
after for a few weeks, and she was having using dreams every single night, and it was exacerbated
hmm,
even more because she had comorbid mental health conditions and a
yeah,
history of trauma, and she was getting her medications changed. So this is a very
yeah,
complex presentation. What I did was I coached her through, and I think this was actually even before I came across the dream completion technique. I used
yeah,
um, imagery rehearsal therapy
yeah,
techniques, though I didn't get her
hmm,
to write everything out. I just wanted to get a quicker and simpler a process. I told her, just imagine there's a different type of ending there. Like, what would you like
yeah,
to happen instead?
yeah, yeah,
And what she wanted to happen was she was offered cannabis, and she wanted instead of having the cannabis there, because she would wake up and she'd look for the cannabis which wasn't there
yeah,
next to her. She's like, I want to have grab the cannabis and throw it into the toilet in my dream. That would make me feel better.
hmm,
And
hmm,
we kind of coached her into that. She imagined that, and I try to get her to say, all right, imagine, is there any way that you can make this memorable, like make the toilet come alive and eat it
uh-huh,
and do something like that?
yeah,
But what she ended up dreaming was she had grabbed the cannabis and she ran to the toilet, but when she got to the toilet and opened her hand, there was no cannabis there.
hmm,
And she said that after that, she was waking up every single night. After that, after doing that, she didn't wake up at night anymore.
hmm,
She wasn't having those using dreams anymore, and her
yeah,
urges to use cannabis were gone. She just didn't have
yeah.
those urges. So just by doing something that simple, of course, I wonder what your thoughts are around something like that. Something, yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
that
that's pretty much, I mean, that's exactly what I'd be advocating. I would probably, what the putting the cannabis down the toilet, probably what you'd want to do in real life. The imagery that was popping into my mind was a massive bonfire, like we do November the 5th bonfires in the UK, big bonfires. And I was kind of imagining, a massive bonfire of cannabis. But and so it's not, the dream doesn't have to be logical, and that ironically was how it played out. The cannabis disappeared from her hand, but that probably wasn't intentional. That was, and we do get these spontaneous healing dreams, when we're kind of open to it, and even going to sleep with the thought I'm in control of my dreams is actually a really positive thought, because it's reasserting your unconscious control over what's going on. So yeah, I mean, what you did is great, and it is. I mean, as I said, there's nothing new under the sun. The image rehearsal therapy, nightmare scripting works well, but we're just tuning it up and making it easier and making it safer and making it more effective and getting a more reliable outcome. And we're packaging putting all the right things in the right places to make it as effective as possible.
this is huge. I mean, what you're mentioning, one of the things that is comes to mind is something you said. I think it was in one of your videos. You were or something that you may have written, but it was a story about a man whose ship was attacked, and
Ah, yeah,
and it was something like decades later.
yes.
He
Had a
can you tell our
spontaneous
audience
healing
that
dream. No,
story?
I will,
Yeah.
I will. And I interestingly, that thought was coming into my mind as you were telling me the story about the lady with the cannabis. I was going to tell you that story. And one of the really interesting things when you're working with a client using this dream completion ideas is that you really do co-create. and trusting your own therapist intuition, ideas bubble up and images bubble up, and you don't impose them on the client, but it really does. It really is interesting. And I will get onto the story in a second. I did this with someone literally last week, and we created something quite weird came into my mind. I'm trying to think what it was now. And the idea, I just kind of floated it to the guy, and it really made sense, and it really resonated with his whole life story. About his dreams had been reflecting his whole life story and the disturbance of it, and it was really quite a bizarre thing. Anyway, so I really do trust that kind of therapist intuition thing. But back to the story. So this was in 1982. Britain, we had one of our kind of small wars against Argentina over the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. Anyway, there was a big disaster where a ship got bombed, and I think 50 or 60 Welsh soldiers were killed, hundreds were injured. It was a real complete disaster. And there was one particular survivor who they made a documentary about him. And he's gone on to become, he's well known, does a lot of charity work, but he had a really severe physical burns. And that's what most people kind of knew, the scarring and everything else. But anyway, he did an interview, which I heard, which was fascinating. So for 20 odd years, he had the same nightmare of being burnt, the ship burning and all his friends dying, and he would wake up sweating, and it was horrible. And then he said in his interview, then it was weird. One night, the dream was different. It wasn't just that. I was actually just walking down the gangplank with my friends, and we were all singing. And he said, the weird thing is when I woke up that morning, it felt like a band had been broken off my chest. And he said, that was the day my PTSD left me. So that was the fascinating thing. He had a spontaneous healing dream. I think it was 24 years later. And I actually contacted him and kind of was trying to get him interested to be a bit of a, patron type thing for the work I was doing. But he couldn't see the relevance of it. And I didn't want to make too much of a thing of it. But, the issue is he didn't need to wait 24 years for a spontaneous healing dream. He could have initiated that same dream himself before that point. And that was, but that's, ultimately, even in the aftermath of a traumatic incident, people have very, very disturbed sleep, and, the material's very strong. People have, that's how we heal from trauma. So many people, if 100 people are in a train accident, within 6 weeks, 90% of them have fully recovered from that, psychologically from that. And it's through dreaming and all the rest of it. So nightmares is just when that process doesn't work. So we're just trying to get the natural healing process back on track, which is why I like this whole process, because we're working with the system, if you like, and we all have a way of healing from psychologically disturbing stuff in the same way our body will heal from a physical trauma. If you've never seen, this is one metaphor I use in my training with people. If someone cuts their arm and you clean and dress it, and a week later you take the plaster off and it's healed. If you've never seen that before, you go, my God, that's amazing. How did that happen? But we take it for granted. And so in terms of psychological healing, I've seen it lots of times, so I'm not surprised. I had a client last week who'd witnessed someone jumping in front of a train the week before. It was pretty bad, very bad. But a week later, he's pretty much psychologically healed from that, using some of the techniques, not just dream completion, but some other stuff as well, which we might get onto. So the ability for us to heal is remarkable, but I'm not surprised by it.
Some of the natural questions that may come out of this is, what sets apart somebody who is able to just go through something very stressful and their brain is able to dream and process it, versus a person who just gets stuck and has nightmares and the rest of that? What is the difference there?
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot of research into this, even in the military, trying to screen out who are the people who are more likely to suffer from psychological wounds and ongoing PTSD, which is PTSD is really the arrested recovery from traumatic event. I think some of the broad research outcomes are, people who've had prior experience of trauma, which in general terms mean childhood trauma. People who've had childhood trauma are more likely to have nightmares and then go on and develop PTSD if they're exposed to trauma as an adult. I think that's a truism. But of course, there are always exceptions to the rule. And you can argue some people who've experienced childhood trauma have actually become very resilient as a result of it. And they've actually it's enhanced their ability to deal with trauma. The other thing, there was a very, very interesting paper that showed people who had childhood nightmares were more likely to go on and not recover from trauma, which again, it kind of implies that nightmares are a sign that your own trauma processing facilities, your own inner healing facilities for trauma have been compromised. And again, with dream completion, we know that we can actually do something about that. So sometimes I say that when we're sorting out nightmares using dream completion, we're tuning up our own trauma processing engine, which is when I go on and if I need to go on and do EMDR after dream completion, I find it goes much quicker and easier because we've tuned up their own trauma processing engine. And again, that's part of what my current research is hoping to evaluate, because it kind of makes logical sense.
And we'll pick up on that briefly. What you've said has triggered a memory that I cover in my book when I'm working on the visualization of dual awareness therapy. So what's going on in the brain? I talk about a instance with when my 7-year-old son, he's now 12, but he was having some really bad visualizations when he was going to bed. He was imagining Pennywise the clown coming at him, coming to get him. And I'd known a little bit about the imagery rescripting and that sort of stuff. And so what I did, I just sat with him and I asked him to imagine what would he like to happen to Pennywise. And what he imagined was, I want Pennywise to be running around screaming and farting. And what he noticed is that after I coached him in it, I got him to close his eyes to imagine that, and he never had that issue again. And so the questions that come out is, when it comes to children and kids who can't go to bed, or kids who are afraid to go to bed for whatever reason, is there a way to sharpen this focus in that area, that anticipatory anxiety, even if they might not wake up?
I mean, you've described it very well. Is what you did is exactly what you do. Why are you afraid of going to sleep? Well, because of this clown. The worst kind of responses are when parents don't be stupid. That's a stupid thought. Go to bed. They're not buying into it. Children have got a very fertile imagination. And of course, you use that by, well, what do you want to happen? Yes, no drama. What do you want to happen? Yeah, runs around. And children are great at this. And in fact, an Australian therapist, I'm sure she's Australian, has written a book called The Dream Director. Lovely, beautifully illustrated book, which is how to basically using this technique for children. And the reason she calls it the Dream Director is she encourages the children to be the director of their dreams and to yell cut. So when whatever that clown name was pops up, yell cut. Okay, what do I want instead? I want to be chasing. And it just works. The only exception for children are what are called night terrors, which are slightly different, which are kind of, you can't wake a child up from night terrors because it's happening in their stage 4 deep sleep. And that's a slightly different thing. You don't tend, the term night terrors is used kind of incorrectly for adults a little bit, but that phenomenon for children, I've never really experienced it, but you might ask them during the day what if they can remember anything, and then you might encourage them to create something, but you can't really, the night terror thing is a slightly different thing. Usually they can't remember anything, but usually children grow out of it too.
It reminds me
sleepwalking is another thing that I haven't really, there's not really a correlation, because sleepwalking in different stages of the sleep to REM sleep.
You
Anyway, sorry.
mentioned that the body during REM sleep is paralyzed, but then there are people
Yeah,
who thrash around
thrash
when they're
around.
dreaming.
Yeah.
So at what stage of sleep does that happen?
Well, that's happening in REM sleep, but what's happened is that the power of the power of the content is exceeding the sleep paralysis. That's and it's very common with combat related trauma because the level of distress is really high. That kind of stuff. Often people are fighting for their life in the dream. And again, when we resolve the dream, when we resolve, when they bend the dreams into a new direction, create some new content for it, which, for those thrashing types of things, imagining you're the Incredible Hulk and throwing people off is actually works incredibly well. Then that behavior calms down. You also get people who don't remember any dream content, but might be screaming, shouting, sweating, lashing out. And again, we found the dream, and that's actually my research. 20% of all the people in my research trial were experiencing that. Technically, they are not experiencing nightmares. That's what some people call night terrors, but it's still a major problem. And the way and dream completion works really well. So people who are sweating really bad. I had one chap who was changing his sheets 3 times a night. The sweating was so bad. But going to sleep, imagining you're sleeping in an ice hotel or you're lying naked in the snow, our sleep is really susceptible to that. And as I said, if you're lashing out, sometimes it's quite counterintuitive. If you're actually screaming in your sleep, the new dream idea might be, singing to the sound of music or singing in a karaoke bar with your friends. That's a very counterintuitive intervention, but what you're actually providing is an outlet for all of that within the dream so that it doesn't become an outlet physically, if that makes sense. Again, you're bending it all in a different direction. You're keeping everything in the washing machine, so to speak, of the dreaming mind to allow the dreams to complete. And that's why we call it dream completion, really, because we want the whole dream process to complete. We're not trying to resolve a nightmare one at a time, which is, again, nightmare rescripting is always framed in that kind of, work on the worst one, then work on the next. We're interested in the whole process, resetting and sleeping through the night.
And so for you, you've mentioned a lot that so people have recurring dreams, and then other people have what you call idiopathic dreams, which may have been things that haven't happened, but like a car losing control, all the rest of that.
Yes.
Or some people may just have every dream each night is different. And the dream completion technique.
Yeah.
You've mentioned. Well, actually, tell me, how would you address those dreams?
So, well, basically, as I said, we're not trying to focus necessarily on individual dreams, but there are 2 different parameters that we're talking about: dreams that are fixed, the same every night, or whether they're changing every night. That's one parameter. And the other parameter is whether it's based on real events that have happened or fictitious or a blend. So you've actually kind of got those 2 continuums going on. And it doesn't really matter. Now, going back to the old techniques of nightmare rescripting, that would only really could be used on dreams that were reoccurring every night because that's what you're working with. But with dream completion, it's much more fluid, much more flexible. We're addressing the theme. If you said, even if people go, it's different every night, what's the general theme? Is it one of being powerless? Is it one of being frightened and in danger? Is it one of, you're witnessing something or is something being done to you? Then, you kind of then just work with the common theme. So you're not trying to, you're not working on one dream at a time. You're helping the whole process. And we're not so bothered about the dream content. I mean, that's why I kind of got interested in these ideas of, just a very generic idea. What does it look like for you to be powerful or safe or alive? And that one idea could work. Or even something that's even less connected with you. What's your favorite TV comedy sketch? And then go to sleep thinking, that's what I want to dream about. and then that can also kind of sort stuff out. So it's really interesting when I'm not focused on resolving a single nightmare. So it doesn't, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether it's fixed or changing, real or imaginary. None of that matters. We're just getting the dream process back on track, if that makes sense. And so, and it doesn't even matter. And as I said, it doesn't matter if you can't remember anything either. You know, you go with whatever symptom or behavior, symptom or sensation that someone's experiencing on waking.
These are really important
there's really
points,
nothing. There's nothing that you can't really do something about. And the question is, how can you have the biggest impact as quickly as possible? And again, that's why, you know, it helps for therapists who are using this with clients to have a bit of a deeper understanding of it. Certainly, you know, the kind of, you know, I get a lot of emails from people saying, yeah, I sent your video, I sent your YouTube link to my client. And that's okay on one level, but it's not okay if you don't really follow it up. How did you find it? Have you found it helpful? Have you solved your nightmares? You know, what did you try? You know, until people try something, nothing will change. And one of the difficulties, particularly with PTSD, is that powerlessness is kind of the symptom of PTSD, the signature symptom of being powerless. And therefore, you know, sometimes people need a bit of extra push to help them create something because by its very nature, they feel powerless to do anything about the nightmare. You know, that's a very common thing.
Some people listening today will say, but Justin, it's not just a dream. Like you've said it before, what you're having is it's just a dream. Some people would have a very, very gut reaction to the term "just a dream" because, like, no, this is something that's happened to me.
It happened for real, yeah.
It happened for real. Like,
yeah.
How do you respond to those concerns?
Yeah, and that's one of the most important questions in terms of trauma therapy generally, not just dreams. Because all trauma therapy, if someone's had a car accident 5 years ago, and when they think about cars, they feel anxious, they can't get in a car, they're having nightmares about the accident. It feels like when they think, you know, they get flashbacks and that the image of them being damaged in the car keep popping up. And, you know, it feels like they're going to die when they think about it. Yeah, that is what that's a traumatic memory that is unprocessed. And any form of trauma therapy is taking that thing from the past and actually trying to get it all based in the present. The present is you didn't die, you're still alive, you're not in the car now. That thing that happened to you 5 years ago is over. And it's the problem is with trauma is that it feels like it happened yesterday. Or in fact, for some people, if you say, does it feel like it happened yesterday? They go, no, it feels like it's happening now. You know, that's the kind of the apex, if you like, of someone who's really experiencing trauma. It feels like it's happening now, even though it happened 50 years ago. So the key part is about getting separation from past and present. And one of the little kind of metaphors that I use with all my trauma clients generally, what I call the lemon test. We can do it just now. You know, everyone listening can do it now. You know, close your eyes. Imagine you're holding a lemon in your hand, and now take a bite out of that lemon, and tell me, Emil, what are you experiencing in your mouth right now as you take that bite?
My mouth is watering.
Yeah. Don't tell me you like lemons, but you get that bitter,
yeah, I get that bitter, that bitter feeling.
Okay.
That's
so
associated.
The question is that a real sensation?
Well,
don't overthink it. It is, yeah. I mean, that's a real sensation. If you thought about chocolate cake or your T-bone steak and your mouth watered, that's a real sensation. The question is, you know, where's the lemon? There is no lemon. That mental picture, it's from our imagination. You know, the word imagination's got image in it. That has created a real sensation. And really, that's just how the mind works. That's how we work. If you think about lying on a beach, you might feel relaxed. If your brain's taking you back to the car accident 5 years ago, you'll feel terrified and fearful, and it feels true. And that bit of psychoeducation just really helps to break the link from just because it feels true doesn't make it true. Now, again, you've got to be a little bit sensitive about this, because you're never denying that something hasn't happened, but it's just not happening now. And it's, you might say, we're not treating, we can't change what happened 5 years ago, but what we're changing is the imprint of what happened 5 years ago and how that's affecting you now. And that imprint is changeable. I mean, when we're doing trauma therapy for, childhood trauma and everything associated with that, we're manipulating and changing narratives and stories and putting things in and taking things out in the same way we are with dreams. It's the same thing. But that's why you've got to do the educational aspect, so people could change their perspective. Because, in the same way someone might say to me, well, you can't change that. That's how it happened. I said, we're not trying to change how it happened. We're changing the imprint of within you. And that's this whole dual awareness thing, the separation of past and present. So it is just a dream, in the same way that your memory is just a memory. But you've got to say it in the most respectful way. You're dealing with someone that's lost a child, or they've witnessed something horrific. You can't just say, well, it's all a figment of your imagination. It's all in your head. But the reality is, it is all in your head. Do you see what I mean? And that lemon test is a very clear way of saying, just because it feels real doesn't make it real in the moment. So that's but the skill of a therapist is doing that with attunement, with empathy, in a very relational way. And that's really what all EMDR is kind of taking a memory from the past that with emotion, body sensation, distressing imagery and beliefs attached to it, and rooting it in the present where it's over. It wasn't, whatever the change in belief is, it wasn't my fault, or I survived, or I'm safe now, and all of the associated feelings with it. And that's kind of, trauma therapy in a nutshell. There you go. Hope you found the lemon thing helpful.
Yeah, I did. Immediately, my mind went, as morbid as this might sound, vomit. I mean, my
Right.
wife, just the thought or feeling of vomit, she just can't. Like, she feels like she's gonna vomit again.
Yeah.
And so I'm the one who takes over the kid duties whenever they've vomited or anything. Not because I
But does
enjoy
that
it,
mean
but
you haven't treated your wife's vomit phobia?
I know, right? I know, right?
Which
It's
is
the curse.
ironically, yeah. But
The
also,
curse of being a therapist. The ones closest to you are not as open to treatment as possible.
that is true. That is true. But yeah, so that's so you've got to be really sensitive, because we're in the early days when doing all this dream completion stuff and nightmare stuff is, and particularly working with veterans who might have experienced really heavy duty trauma. And, you start off with, it's just a dream, and they'll get very hot under the collar, to say the least. You can offend someone very greatly. So that's why you've got to be really sensitive about all of this stuff. And, and although some people, we might use, cartoon characters and superheroes and change this and change that, you've got to be sensitive to what the person's bringing to start with. Which is when winding all the way back, dealing with bereavement. I don't get into manipulating. We're not changing the past. We're not manipulating things. How would you like to remember the person is the most helpful kind of solution for that. Yeah.
I think before we go into, because I want to touch on the flash technique as well, something that you've been quite vocal about. But what if the dream or the memory is highly, highly shameful? So the person, for example, may have a particular response to a traumatic event that is highly shameful. They feel
sexual
ashamed
abuse, like some kind of sexual abuse type thing.
Yes.
The key thing there is,
how would you reframe or how would you coach a person through someone who's experiencing that?
Mhm. And so again, that comes up very, that in a lot of the work I do, that's not an infrequent thing. The first thing is not to dwell on the nightmare. So I would never say to someone, tell me what's going on in your dream. And this will lead on to the flash technique in a second, but just dealing with the dream side of things, we don't need to know the content of the dream. Just the knowledge that, it's a dream about an abuse thing that happened when I was young is enough. And so then you might say, you don't want to get them to focus. You start focusing on it, they'll get triggered by it. And then we've broken the first commandment of trauma therapy, which is don't trigger the client unnecessarily, don't cause distress unnecessarily. Safety is the most important thing with all trauma therapy. So I would probably say, does it feel really powerless? Does what's going on in the dream feel really powerless, or does it feel really unsafe, or whatever it is? And then I would, as I said before, we don't go there, we go somewhere over here. So what would it look like for you to feel powerful? And then, so you're not using, there's no exposure to the nightmare content and the trauma by definition, and you're encouraging them to create something new. And in a way, that's, the dream completion technique predates the flash technique, and that would be my first port of call. But in a minute, I'll tell you about the flash technique, because that is now my first port of call in combination sometimes with dream completion.
Is there anything that you would like to say, or any question I could have asked about the dream completion technique before we go into the flash technique?
No, I don't think so. The only thing I'd say is that although we got the word technique, we're banding the word technique about here. I'm not someone that, it's kind of, therapy is a very relational thing, and it's not, some people get into scripted. I know the world of EMDR can be a bit like this, scripted protocols for problem A, B, and C. And, we apply tools in a framework, and we work with the client. And that's the one thing I'd like to say. And if, I've got some, I don't know if they're publicly available on YouTube, but, I certainly do it in my webinars, where we'll be doing live demonstrations of these techniques. And, we're not painting by numbers. And that's really important to kind of know. We're not sheep dipping people, but it can look like that, or it can feel like that when we're talking about all these techniques. But I know I would just encourage people to, check out some of my resources on my website, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and the fact that I've got a webinar coming up, which probably will work for the Australian audience, 9 o'clock in the morning, probably 6 o'clock your time or something.
Yeah, 6 p.m. All right, yeah, that's
6
good.
p.m. or something like that. But we can put all the links in the show notes. But it's and for any therapists of any modality, or even anyone just interested in the subject, because you don't actually need to be a therapist to use dream completion. I met someone in a bar once, and we were having a drink at the bar, and they're telling me about nightmares, and it's, what about this? What about that? Have you thought about this? What do you think's happening? Why don't you try this? And
Funny you should say that.
Funny you should say that. I just finished writing 80,000 words about it. And so that's where, that global eradication of nightmares. I mean, it was I haven't really mentioned it since I wrote the little slide, but it's, I would love that. I would love to partner with people. I haven't had any traction with like World Health Organization, some of the big NGOs, but they're dealing with disaster relief scenarios or war, famine scenarios. This is, this is a core part of the problem that's affecting people. So it really doesn't, we've got some good tools, and it's not about, it's not about making money or commercializing them. Just, like the Ukraine thing, I'd love I'd love I'd love 1 million people to watch the 5-minute video if it will help. But it's that traction of getting ideas out there, it's just a difficult one. And so any of your listeners that want to get in touch, find my email address. You'll find me on Google, and do, because there's no reason why people should be suffering when they're suffering enough. That's kind of what I would say.
This is
That's probably
important.
it on dream completion.
This is good. Let's jump on into the flash technique, or I've heard you
Yeah,
call it the blink technique.
that's correct. And this is, again, this is developed by another therapist, a chap called Dr. Phil Mansfield, an American, Californian, San Francisco based EMDR trainer, therapist, been around a long time. He developed this. But it's what's really interesting, all trauma therapy requires people to talk, think, and feel their trauma as a way of processing and resolving it. That's always been the historical narrative. Exposure therapy is exactly that. It's like watching a horror film 100 times. It might start feeling better. But we know with the trauma, when you're dealing with extensive trauma, it's bloody hard. The dropout is very significant, and it's painful. And if the therapist is inadequately trained, you can re-traumatize people by talking about your trauma. So, it's not great. Then trauma therapy is kind of evolved. CBT kind of introduced a little bit more different elements to it, but still exposure was a key part. EMDR still involves an element of exposure before you start doing the bilateral stimulation, which means there's still a risk of abreaction or dissociation. And an awful lot of CPD, professional development as an EMDR therapist, was about handling extreme levels of trauma. For that reason, what makes the flash technique or the blink technique a game changer is that clients do not need to think about, talk about, or feel the trauma and that he's found a method of taking the top off, or even processing all of the traumatic memory, without the therapist having to ask the client talk about it, think about it, feel it, which for me is the holy grail of trauma therapy, because it's safe. The very thing that's, you can't, even with EMDR, you can't jump into processing a trauma in session one. In fact, it's unethical. It's downright bloody dangerous. I mean, there are certain circumstances where you can, but in the most part, you don't start processing a trauma in the first session. You might have to do a lot of stabilization first, because the person, complex PTSD, extreme, childhood trauma, whatever it is. The flash technique offers us an opportunity to process stuff without going near it. And that's the clever thing. Why is it called the flash technique? Which is not a great name, especially if you work with sexual abuse or military people who've been blown up. Yeah, not a good name. But the reason the name came into existence was what Phil discovered, and he wrote a paper in about 2017, was that if you start from a resource state and you flash to a trauma memory and back again so quickly, a little bit like putting your hand through a flame very quickly, he found that there was a processing and a desensitization effect on the trauma memory. Yeah. And that the blink thing was his cue to go to the trauma memory and back again. Now, interestingly, what he then discovered, and that was highly effective, but of course there are some dangers there, because you could get stuck in the trauma memory. But what he discovered was that you didn't need to go to the trauma memory. You could just stay in some resource state, do a blink, and then there will be a processing effect. And what that has evolved into is an even more streamlined thing where, in session one, you've had a new client the other week, 10 minutes in, I'm using the flash technique just because of what they brought. And, I didn't get them to talk about it, but we knew if I asked, I said, would this be really difficult to talk about? And, you get that look. And what we do with the flash technique is we kind of identify the target. And although it's really simple, it's a very simple process, you've got to do it precisely. There's we kind of paint the target without going there. Yeah. So you might say the thing that happened to you when you were 10, and then you put it over there, and then you start having a discussion with them about, we can have a discussion about, Emil, tell me about your book, Tapping for Trauma. I can see it on the bookshelf behind you. During that conversation, every so often, when I say the word blink, I get you to blink 3 times. So we do, and I do that kind of 5, 6, 7 times. And then we stop the conversation. I say, let's just go back to what we started with. And then I ask the question, do you notice any change, yes or no? And very often the distress level will have come down. And it's a permanent shift. There's something's happened with the physiology of that memory, if you like. And although it sounds bizarre and simple, it actually works. And so, yeah, that is the flashlight. Now, there's a lot of, and again, I do a 3-hour webinar on how to integrate that with EMDR, and there's a lot more learning. There are some fascinating offshoots of it. I've done it.
And this is separate to the dream completion technique, the webinars.
Yeah, completely. Completely separate.
Different webinars.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's
continue.
a different technique. It's a different technique, but it does intersect a little bit. But there's some fascinating things. I've used this. You could also work on multiple memories at the same time. So I might get a client to create a list of different memories, and we put the list over there, and then we go and talk about, what their favorite TV program is, or what they like, or what their hobby is, or tell me about your pet. Do these blinks, and then we go back to the list, and then multiple memories may have gone down. Now, maybe not all of them have gone down. And again, what we cover in the webinar is what happens when it doesn't work and troubleshooting and all the rest of it. But at its core, it means you could, if someone tells you, a chap many years ago who wrote on a piece of paper, handed to me, I was raped at school, age 13. Now, the minute you start talking about that, it's going to be triggering probably. But with the flash technique, you can just say, so let's just put that piece of paper over there, and then let's start talking about something you're interested in. Do these blinks. It's weird, but it works. There's been quite a lot of research. If you go to the flashtechnique.com website, you'll find 12 or 13 papers. They've done some RCTs. But it really does represent the holy grail for me, because you can do stuff with trauma memories in a very safe way online, particularly because I work online, without triggering the stuff. And that's fantastic. But, and this is again fascinating, when you get a simple technique, I do a lot of supervision groups and all that. Oh, have you heard of the flash technique? Yes, yeah, I use the flash technique. Oh, how do you use it? And then you hear something, it's like, that's not quite right. Some people treat it as I'll just do a bit of flash at the end of a session on it. And they're not doing flash on a target, they're doing flash on an emotion. And, so there's a lot of, when things are really simple, people don't do it the right way necessarily. But anyway, it's fascinating. If you were up for it, I could even do a demonstration, very blind to therapist demonstration with you, Emil.
I would love to do that.
This is high stakes. I always do this in my trainings. I do get a volunteer therapist, and what we do is I'll ask them if they've got something they'd like to work on, but they don't necessarily need to tell everybody. They might do, but they don't have to. So we do that blind to therapist, because again, people don't know what's going to happen to the recording, and they might not want to talk about something. So anyway, it's not necessarily a high risk strategy, but it wakes me up. It'll wake me up now, because
no, I'd love to do that, just to give our listeners a bit of an idea of how this could look like. So are you asking for me to come up with a bit of a target to begin with?
Yeah, and the only thing, and it can really be anything. You don't obviously have to share it. And if you were to think about it, I probably don't want a sub 10 target. That's really, but again, we could work on it. The other thing is we want something that's kind of a bit standalone would be helpful, rather than something that's part of a pattern. But again, so anyway, has something come to mind?
Something's come to mind. I can locate a target.
And if you were to know, and again, I don't want you to really bring it up, think about it too much, but if you were to know how to stressing out of 10 it was, where 10 is the worst and 0's nothing, what kind of number would you give it?
It's hard for me to say, because I have the image, but I don't have a significant
emotional
distress, but it brings out a sense of sadness, a real sense of sadness, and a like, it's one of those memories of like, I did the wrong thing, and
Right.
and there's nothing that I could do that's going to change what happened. But
Uh-huh.
it feels like it's a very cognitive thing, but a
Does
big
it
sense
still
of
feel a bit
sadness.
like it's your, but it still feels a bit like it's your fault?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So again, this is a really interesting situation. So in a clinical situation, I would probably default to EMDR processing with this because, and this is why Flash and EMDR are very complementary because this is not, there are not high levels of emotion associated with this, but there's kind of there's potential interlinking. There's a sense of I'm responsible, I did something wrong, and there's probably some body sensation, and it's kind of something that needs to be opened up a little bit to resolve. Um,
Mm,
and even the fact that it's the levels of distress are relatively low, so that would be very amenable to EMDR processing. Um, whereas with Flash, it's kind of, it might have an effect, it might not have an effect. I'm quite happy to give it a go,
yeah.
so to speak. The benefit is we're not going to, there's very little chance, there's no chance of any harm happening in this situation because we're not opening it up. And what I say is that, Flash is far less dangerous than a poor history tape, if that makes sense. A poor
Mm,
history tape where someone opens up trauma, but too many trauma boxes all at once is terrible. And it's one of the the issues I find with maybe people who maybe just recently trained in EMDR and they kind of oh, we're phase one history taking, that's what we do. You and they kind of somehow forget they're a therapist. You've got to be, people drop out and don't come for trauma therapy because it's painful. You're asking people, even telling you their history, to touch a hot stove. So you've got to be really sensitive to all of that, which is why I like Flash, because the minute anything looks tricky for anybody, I then might use the Flash technique just as a way of bringing it down, bringing the distress down. Which, of course, if you're doing this in session 1 or 2, the client is kind of, A, they start trusting you. B, they sense immediately that this stuff that they thought could never change can change, and and you're just building confidence and hope right from the very start, which is so important with trauma work. And if you just launch into, okay, give me your life history and all the shit, it's just not good. Anyway, so going back to what you suggested, what you brought. So again, when the trauma is really high level, you don't push it at all.
mhm.
But with what you brought, we need to push it a bit to kind of open it up. We need to make it a bit more malleable,
Yep.
if that makes sense. So I wouldn't. This is not an example. This is not a demonstration, if you like, of using a Flash technique with a very intense memory.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. So okay. So when are you comfortable or not sharing what the thing is? This doesn't really matter either way, but
Um,
uh,
Probably not
not.
on.
Then that's fine.
Okay.
Then leave it at that. So the question is: so when you think about this event, was this something that happened when you were much younger or as an adult? Again, just to help me contextualize it a bit.
When I was in my 20s.
Okay, okay. And so when you think about that event now, what's the kind of the worst part? Is it the image? Is it the body sensation? Is it the emotion? Is it the thought fucked up or mucked up? Apologies for swearing on your
No, no,
podcast.
no. You can do that. Be yourself. Be yourself. Um, I think it's so I'd done something, and then someone's seen me, and then I just realized how shitty that thing was. And
Mm-hmm.
so I know
Mm-hmm.
that this is very vague, but then it's like,
No, no,
oh
no, no. It's fine.
crap.
This is fine. So when you think about that now, what are you noticing in your body right now?
There's a lightness in my legs. My legs are getting
Mm-hmm.
lighter.
Yeah.
I'm noticing it was almost like pressure that's coming in my head.
In
My
your
hands are
head.
getting a
Uh-huh.
little bit sweaty.
Okay.
Um,
And the thought, I screwed up.
Mm.
Uh-huh. Okay. So okay, so that's kind of, and if you had to give, I know you struggled to give it a number, but if you had to give a number for the whole thing about how bad it feels now, the distress of it, where ten's the worst, naught's nothing.
I'd say it'd
It
be
doesn't,
something
it
like a 5 or a
seven or
6,
five.
not
Okay,
nothing.
five. Yeah, yeah, five or
ma-
six. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. Okay. So what we're gonna do, we're just gonna put that all over there, and we're gonna just chat about something that you find interesting. So what kind of hobbies have you got, Emil? Or
Ah,
maybe you could tell me about your children, who are probably your
yeah.
number
Well,
one hobby in terms of time. Or
I recently wrote a kids book, and it was
okay, let's just pause there. Pause it.
yep,
So we're gonna just have this chat. When you hear me say the word blink, I just want you to blink 3 times rapidly like that, literally
yep,
like that.
yep.
Okay. And we'll do that. We'll chat for a bit. So anyway, but before we do that, just go back to what we started with, the thing that happened in your 20s. And I just want you just kind of bring that back into your awareness
Mm-hmm.
one last time before we put it over there. And so, yeah, tell me, what is this book about?
Well, it's
Blink,
called Caspian and the
blink.
Zombified.
Remember when I say the word blink? And it might feel like I'm interrupting you. I should have said
Yeah.
that. So
So three
Caspian and the what?
blinks,
Sorry?
three
Three blinks.
blinks.
Yeah, yeah. But just like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
You can do it as quick as you can, but it doesn't matter. But
All right. Yep.
okay, yeah. What was the book called, Em?
Caspian and the Zombified Gastropods.
Okay,
And
this is not a textbook. This is not a this is a
no,
story,
it's
yeah?
a kid's story book that my oldest son's name
Blink.
is
Yeah, that's
yeah.
it. Your oldest son's name is, I know
His name is
it feels a bit clunky, but don't worry.
no,
We'll go with
no,
that.
that's okay. My oldest son's name is Castiel, and so the characters in the book are a play on my two kids' names. So Castiel and Micah. There's
Uh-huh.
Caspian and Michael in
Blink.
the book.
Blink. Yeah, cool. Okay. You can go a bit further. It doesn't have, you just do it as a little flatter. You don't have
Okay,
you don't have,
okay,
yeah, it doesn't matter too much.
okay.
It feels like you're trying really hard to follow my instruction,
Yes,
but
yes. I
it's
feel like
fine.
I'm blinking hard. All
Don't
right.
worry, don't worry.
So
Um,
the book was originally written for them, and then I just wanted to get it out there as well because I thought it'd be a pretty cool story to share with others.
Excellent. When did you publish it?
It's coming up, so within I
Blink.
think
Yeah.
did that. I did the blinks quickly. Okay.
I know it's all a bit strange. So let's just take a pause. So let's
Yep.
just take a pause from this. Let's just go back to what you started with, the thing that happened in your 20s. And then
Mhm.
just tell me if you notice any change, yes or no, overall. Don't feel compulsed to say yes. Um, it may feel less distressing further away, or there may be no change at
Um, it's probably a slight change in terms
all.
of intensity. Probably
Yeah,
a one or so
maybe drop down.
drop.
Okay.
Yeah,
So just look at what's the worst part of it right now in your mind.
I think it's progressed a little bit, so it's not
Uh-huh.
stuck to the original image that I had. It's more
Yeah.
progressed
Okay.
to another area of that image of that
Uh-huh.
memory.
Okay. Uh, so let's just again put all of that over there
Mhm.
and tell me about some of the other books. How many books have you written? You sound quite prolific.
I've
Um,
written I've written a few. I think 5 in
Blink.
total. Yeah.
Yeah. And which one's
Um,
been your bestseller?
None of them. So I have a problem with
Blink.
marketing. So
Uh-huh.
yeah,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
for
But
me, I love to write, and then when it comes
uh-huh.
to getting the word out and advertising and all that sort of stuff, that's not my strong point. So I write
Blink.
because I enjoy it, but
Blink.
it's yeah,
Yeah.
still
Well,
yet
that's what, and
to.
you're getting the word out now, which is great. And so okay, and yeah, and a mixture of fiction and non-fiction by the sounds of it.
Yeah, yeah, I've been writing since I was a little kid. It was
Oh
in a way it
wow.
was my escape from some of the tricky things in life. But
Blink.
yeah.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So let's just take a pause there again.
Mhm.
And I know it does feel a bit artificial, and it does feel like I'm interrupting you. I probably should have said that right bit at the start, but because
Good.
that can be a bit off-putting for people. But there's a good reason, because we're kind of interrupting what's going on inside. Inside. So again, let's just go back to what happened in your 20s and tell me if you
Mhm.
notice any more change there. And again, it might be quite subtle, because I said at the beginning, we're not dealing with the typical thing I'd be dealing with.
Well, I feel like it's continued to reduce.
Uh-huh.
Again, the memory is progressing in terms of what had
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah.
Um, and now I'm starting to think more about the positive things that I've been speaking with you about.
Right.
Uh,
Almost as
it,
if that's coming in front of it.
yeah, that's kind of coming in front. That's what I'm noticing.
Mhm. Good. Well, look, that's probably an okay place to stop it. And you just got a sense of the process. Now, of course, if so I literally did this yesterday with someone that had witnessed a fatal incident right in front of them. And you can imagine that the content of that is very, very distressing, and it has the same effect. In fact, it had a quicker and a more dramatic effect. In fact, the first time I ever did this was with the prison officer who'd opened the door and found something pretty horrible. And
Mm,
the first set of the blinks we did, when I said go back to what you started with, he was doing this. He kind of, I can't get it. Can't get that anymore. Now, again, I've seen that before. It wouldn't, but that was still very dramatic. And so, and all the distress associated with that image went. And in the morning, he woke up and it was still the same. It had gone. And
wow.
that's why it's a game-changing event. We could have, we could have moved into lots of different ways of resolving the residue of what you experienced in your 20s, which is probably fair. It's the residue. There was sadness associated with it. It's kind of relatively low level. My treatment of choice would have been to move in and done some EMDR processing. We'd have done that
Mm,
in a webinar demonstration. That's probably what I would have done. But anyway, you got a sense of it, and it's even when we're dealing with something really traumatic or difficult, you can switch from that to having an engaging chat, even though it felt like I was interrupting you a bit, maybe,
yep, yeah.
where people are laughing. And that's the remarkable thing. And it's just what is going on. It's a form of memory reconsolidation. There is obviously some links between the target and what's going on in someone, and kind of you're almost creating circuits or something between the resource state and the distressing state and doing something.
Well,
We
in
don't know
essence,
how that
it's a
works.
dual awareness that you're keeping one foot in the present and the other foot
Yeah.
in the past, and that's
Yes.
something from a flat
Yeah,
that's a
yeah, it
really
is.
interesting one.
It is dual awareness, but the interesting part is that the foot in the past is incredibly fleeting,
Mm,
and and they don't have to say anything, and it's almost like you're putting a laser pointer on something in your memory. We kind of say you're loading it into your working memory, but the point is, it doesn't need to be. It just needs to be the merest briefest of kind of association. And I did this with a paramedic. We had 13 items on the list, and not all of them reduced, but we did the same thing. And so within 5 or 10 minutes, you can get a reduction of the trauma load that someone's carrying. That's quite significant. I mean, I've never come across anything where you can process 13 things simultaneously without talking about the darn stuff. That's
my,
why I
my,
think it's so interesting.
I have a question around if okay, so what if the trauma is happening right now? So what if the person's uh,
We're in a
let's
domestic
just say
violence situation, for
domestic
example.
violence
Yeah.
or incredible family stress or
Mm.
these sort of, let's just say they're at a war or
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
they're
yeah,
in
yeah.
a
So they're
they're in
gonna,
a
yeah,
workplace situation where they can't seem to
yeah.
escape. They're just always stressed. At what,
Hmm.
like, how does something like this fit into to stresses that are currently happening?
Yeah. Well, that's a general question for any trauma therapy. The key question is trauma. what's happening when we're experiencing trauma is generally our resilience goes down. In fact, in the from a military perspective, the whole business about everyone will break down after a certain amount of combat exposure. That was kind of been scientifically researched, because you're filling up with trauma, if you like, and you reach a point when you're full. So I think you definitely doing trauma therapy, even if you're still in the midst of trauma, is a good thing, because you're emptying your trauma tanks. You're creating more resilience. And it just so happens that the flash technique is a good and safe way of doing it, and it can be used in groups. Phil Mansfield has done work in Ukraine as well. With you can have a few hundred people on a Zoom call and do group flash. So you can reduce people's trauma load, and I think it's just a very safe way of doing it. So I would much prefer to do that than exposure therapy, which is margin in the hands of someone inexperienced, is re-traumatizing. So definitely when people are in the midst of trauma, you want to help them discharge that trauma, even though that ideally you'd want to withdraw them from the trauma, but that's not always possible in war or whatever.
It's really interesting. You've mentioned before that there are different ways. So the flash technique in its inception looks a little bit different to the way that it's evolved over time. I think you've said that in a previous
definitely. It's definitely got in. It's been refined and enhanced.
So what you've just done, is that what's currently being used, or is that reminiscent of the original?
No. That's the current. No, definitely no. That's the current incarnation, if you like. The original incarnation, as I said, is flashing to a memory, and then it had a slightly more there was a lot more complicated build up of, you did double blinks, triple blinks, and it's just got refined and simplified. Even we were talking about your books and stuff. When it was started, it was called a positive engaging focus. You get someone to go to a past positive memory and think about it. But actually, so you might say, if skiing was your hobby, think about your best day skiing. Now I would say, tell me about your best day skiing. So it's what we call the conversational engaging. And the fact that if some people haven't got some people who've got a long history of mental health issues, they haven't been skiing, they haven't got a whole lot of lovely hobbies and families and resources. But you can say, well, what do you like watching on TV? We could talk about anything. I could even do a little, countdown from 100 in threes or something. We've got lots of options for doing that. So it's evolved. I'm a firm believer in innovation and evolution, and as I said, building on the shoulders of giants. This is Phil Mansfield work, but I like to think I've added some bits to it. I teach it in my own way and whatever. There's no copyright of ideas. You can't copyright ideas, if that makes sense. And I think the world of therapy is full of this. I mean, we know there are thousands of different therapy modalities, So that's it. Dream completion, flash technique. Sometimes I might do, if someone comes with very intense trauma with nightmares, we might do a bit of flash to kind of take the sting out of it before doing some dream completion. And then before doing some EMDR, those are the three kind of things of currency, if you like, for me: dream completion, flash technique, and EMDR. I believe that's a really powerful combination of therapies.
You've really spoken very accessibly. You've anyone who's listening, whether they're a clinician or whether they'd be a client, a person who's just trying to find some relief, I think they've got a lot to think about and a lot to work on and a lot to apply even just tonight. And so this is something that's huge, and I'm looking forward to spreading the word as it goes, and giving more and more people a bit of a taste of this, and referring people to yourself when it comes to learning a little bit more about these techniques and how to do them with their clients, and figuring things out from that point of view. Before we do end today, I do want to ask you, or give you the opportunity, Justin, to to say, well, if there is something that we have missed, or if there's a question that I haven't asked that I could have asked, what's your sense? What would you like to leave the listeners
Yeah,
with
no,
today?
I think the thing that's most important, particularly for potential clients, anybody who's experienced trauma, is, the common misconception is, I'm going to be stuck with this forever. My life is ruined. I can't unsee what I've seen. And that's, the trauma therapy has come such a long way that we know that's not true. So there's real hope for anybody who's experienced severe trauma, and that it doesn't, and that the effects of it can be reversed. We can't, we're not erasing people's memories. We're not using hypnosis, but we're helping people heal from the inside out. And that's really the message, whether it's dream completion, whether it's flash technique, whether it's EMDR therapy, that we've got great tools, and in the hands of competent therapists, there's such, the message of hope is the most important thing. And that's what I would really like to see. I'd like to see everything to be more accessible and easier to access. And on the therapist side, if you want to develop your knowledge and get more experience and see how these tools are used in practice, really deepen your knowledge, then check out my webinars on my website, justinhavens.com. But it's been a pleasure speaking to you. The demonstration, I want to say it again though, it was a demonstration, and you saw some change, which is what we're looking for. Adaptive change is always the goal of therapy, but it probably, we did it for demonstration purposes. I probably would have done something different clinically, rather than use flash in that situation. But we got an essence of what it is. There are some, I think that's all there is to say. I'm going to go and have some breakfast now, I think.
No, this is really good. This is really good. And it's ending on a very good note, because my laptop seems to be running out of juice at the moment.
Okay,
so
well then that's a good way to put it.
But thank you so much for coming in today, and just giving us your time. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, and I'm looking forward to keeping in touch and sharing this around.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Emil. Bye-bye.